And we are reading from Alfred Korzybski's Science and Sanity. This is chapter 29 on Non-Aristotelian training. If the preliminary experiments described above should be fully upheld, an important fact in the physiology of the cortex will be disclosed, namely that new connections can be established in the cortex, not only in the areas of optimal excitability, but also in those areas which are in one or another phase of inhibition. That's Ivan Pavlov. That wretched monosyllable all has caused mathematicians more trouble than all the rest of the dictionary. E.T. Bell. These observations point to the view that the mechanism of development of a conditioned reflex and the mechanism of external inhibition are somehow similar, and that the process of external inhibition bears some relation to the development of new connections between different cortical elements. In particular, the factor of duration of time was shown to act as a real physiological stimulus, and experiments were described in which definite time intervals appeared as effective stimuli. Pavlov. The procedure for training in the present system by the aid of the differential flows directly from the theoretical considerations which have been explained in the foregoing chapters. The contentions of the system have been verified experimentally in all cases where it has been consistently applied. The main aim is to acquire the coveted consciousness of abstracting, on which non-delusional evaluation is based, and which becomes the foundation for non-pathological semantic reactions in sanity. As we deal with different aspects of an organic process which inherently works as a whole, all these aspects appear strictly interrelated. We have found, by analysis, two main aspects which underlie the others. It appears that the Aristotelian structure leads to semantic states which can be formulated as the feeling of allness, and that through the is of identity, it leads to the confusion of orders of abstractions. Thus, for training, the program is readily sketched. We must first eliminate the allness, then we must impart the peculiar stratification of human knowledge, which follows from the rejection of the is of identity. In other words, eliminate identification. It becomes also obvious that a theory of sanity cannot be separated from a non-Aristotelian system. Since the organism works as a whole, all nerve centers should be trained so as to impart a permanent, lasting, and ingrained feeling of abstracting. Once this has been achieved, the recognition of the vertical and the horizontal stratification of human knowledge becomes also a permanent semantic state. This gives us a kind of semantic coordinate system in which we can represent any life situation or scientific situation or any difficulty with great clarity and so evaluate them properly. In verbal theoretical explanations, this procedure appears complex. In practice, it is not so. It is extremely simple provided we persistently follow the instructions, which are based on theory and practice. Above all, we must not expect results too quickly. For reasons already explained, students should not only hear and see the explanations, but should also perform for themselves, should handle the labels and indicate with their hands the different orders of abstractions. After preliminary explanations, the children should be called to the differential, and using their hands, they should explain it. This applies also to grown-ups and to patients. The differential is not only a permanent structure and semantic reminder which affects many nerve centers, it is more, for in training, it conveys the natural order through all centers. Any reader who refuses to use his hands in this connection handicaps himself seriously, because ordering abolishes identification. Fundamentally, there is no structural difference between the use of language and the use of any other mechanical device. They all involve reflex action. It is well known that any pianist, telegraph operator, typist, or chauffeur would not be a successful performer if he had to meditate about every move he makes. As a rule, verbal explanations of the working of the respective machines are necessary at first, yet the structural reflex skill required is actually acquired by prolonged practice, where again all nervous centers are involved. We all know what amazing unconscious reflex adjustments a good driver of a car can make in a case of unexpected danger. A similar semantic reflex skill is required in handling our linguistic apparatus, and in case of danger of sudden turns and twists, our orientation should also work unconsciously. That is why the structural feeling for the working of the apparatus is required. All nerve centers should be trained to employ the most effective means to affect the organism and its working as a whole. The semantic training of grown-ups and that of children do not differ in essentials. Children have fewer established habits, have more fluid semantic reactions than adults, and therefore the results with children are achieved more quickly and last better. I shall now explain how to train children. A similar method applies to adults also, but an adult should not trust himself too much that he has completely acquired consciousness of abstracting. He must train very thoroughly. I speak from personal experience. Although I have the differential before my eyes practically always and am the author of the present system, yet every once in a while I catch myself with one of the old vicious semantic habits. Habits, and particularly linguistic habits, may be very pernicious and difficult to change. We do not need to start with profound theoretical considerations. We may start with any familiar daily life objects and a microscope or magnifying glass. We bring the differential into the classroom with labels, except one, detached, but do not proceed to explain it. We start with a little semantic experiment upon the subject of allness. We take any actual object, an apple, a pencil, or anything else which is familiar to the children. The principles involved are entirely general and apply to all objective levels in a very similar way. We tell them that we will have some fun. Then we ask them to tell us everything or all about the object in question. In this case, the apple. When the children begin to tell us all about it, we write the characteristics down on the blackboard. This last is vital. We must have a visual and extensional record of the ascribed characteristics. When the children have exhausted their ingenuity in telling all about the apple, we should not be satisfied. We should make them doubt, urging them that perhaps they did not tell us all about it, using the word all continually. The term all should be stressed and repeated to the point of the children's being thoroughly annoyed with the term. The more they learn to dislike this term, the better. We are already training a most important semantic reaction. We should not be satisfied with the best answers made by the most intelligent children. In a large class, there may even be a child who tells us bluntly that it is impossible to tell all about the apple. We should concentrate on the less intelligent children and deal particularly with them. There are many and important reasons for this. For one thing, the children become more eager and more interested in their own achievement. Then, too, they easily learn by example what a difference in intelligence means. This understanding of the shortcomings of others has an important semantic broadening effect. In life, numerous serious hurts occur precisely because we do not appreciate some natural shortcomings and expect too much. Expecting too much leads to very harmful semantic shocks, disappointment, suspicions, fears, hopelessness, helplessness, and pessimism. The less bright children benefit also. The experiment is conducted on their level so that they also have the maximum chance to benefit. Soon the children begin to argue about the new method and to explain it to each other by themselves. For we have touched very vital and complex semantic processes of curiosity, achievement, ambitions, characteristics strongly represented in the child's life. We evade also the danger of taking clever yet shallow replies as standard. The last error would be fatal, as the issues are fundamental, and we should not rest content with mere verbal brilliancy. When the subject seems exhausted, and the list of characteristics of the apple complete, we repeatedly make certain that the children assume they have told us all about it. We cut the apple into pieces and show the children experimentally, using eventually a microscope or magnifying glass, that they did not tell us all about the apple. It may appear to some educators that such training might involve some undesirable psychological results, but later, when consciousness of abstracting is acquired as a lasting semantic state, this fear appears entirely unjustified, as explained further on. The first step in dealing with reality seems to demand that we abandon entirely the older delusional methods. When the children have become thoroughly convinced of the non-allness and the impossibility of allness, we are ready to explain to them what the word abstracting means, using again the terms all and not all. We show them a small rotating fan and explain to them about the separate blades which, when rotating, we see as a disk. In such demonstrations, we can go as far as desired. All science supplies data, e.g., the dynamic structure of seemingly solid materials. We must select the data according to the age of the children or the knowledge of the grown-ups. Everything said should be demonstrated empirically from a structural point of view. The next step is to demonstrate practically that an object taken from different points of view has different aspects for different observers. We may use different objects or wooden geometrical figures painted with different colors on different sides. We may place the object in different positions and ask the children their descriptions, which should be written down. The descriptions will, of course, be different, and the children should be made thoroughly aware of this. In all these preliminary exercises, the ingenuity of the teacher has a vast field for exercise, and we do not need to enter into details. When all these results have been accomplished on the level of the least developed child, we then proceed to explain the differential as a structural diagrammatic summary of the above results. It is a positive condition that the new language be used and that an object be described as an abstraction of some order. If this vital structural point is disregarded, most of the psychological semantic benefits of non-allness are either lost or greatly lessened. We should make this term clear to the child and should train him in its use, as it appears uniquely in accordance with the structure and the functioning of his nervous system. The child should be warned that the old languages are not structurally suitable for their future understanding and semantic adjustments. This warning should be repeated seriously and persistently. Having eliminated allness, we began to eliminate the is of identity, which at the primitive and infantile stages of racial human development happens to be extremely ingrained in our semantic reaction, embodied as it is in the structure of our daily language. As was explained before, identification is a natural reaction of the animal, the primitive man and the infant, reflected and systematized in the Aristotelian and older linguistic systems, which, through the ignorance or neglect of parents and teachers, is not counteracted, and so is continued into the lives of children and grown-ups until finally it becomes embodied in the structure of what we call civilization, 1933. In a theory of adjustment or sanity, we must counteract this animalistic, primitive, or infantile semantic reaction by building an Non-Aristotelian system, which entirely rejects the is of identity. In the Aristotelian system, through the use of the is, different orders of abstractions were unconsciously identified in values, an obvious contradiction to empirical facts. In other words, being identified in values, they were treated as of one order or on one level, and so did not necessitate indefinitely many expanded orders of horizontal and vertical differences. Similarly, with the objectively meaningless infinite velocity of a process, it does not allow order. But once we have a finite velocity of a process, order makes its appearance as an indispensable aspect of a process. The finite and known velocity of nerve currents on the psychomathematical levels results in ordered series on physiological levels, in non-identity and proper evaluation on semantic levels, and in orders of abstractions and a non-Aristotelian system and general semantics on verbal levels. Once we abolish in our language the always false to fact is of identity, we automatically stop identifying different orders of abstractions. We do not assume that they represent one level, which becomes expanded into a natural ordered series of indefinitely many different orders of abstractions with different values. Adjustment, therefore, sanity, and adulthood of humanity depend on proper evaluation, impossible under conditions of delusional identification of fundamentally different orders of abstractions. We must then train the semantic reactions in the natural physiological order of the process of abstracting, which on the psychological levels become non-pathological semantic evaluation. In the case of training in the non-allness, it was necessary to start with the analysis of an ordinary object to give the child a simplified theoretical explanation and then to demonstrate it empirically. The child will be easily convinced, but this conviction is not enough, because it will not affect permanently his semantic reaction. We explain this difficulty very simply, telling him that, although he agreed with our presentation, he will very soon forget it. And so we need a permanent visual reminder, which is supplied by the strings freely hanging from the event and from the object and indicating those characteristics left out or not abstracted. In the elimination of the is of identity, we have also structurally interconnected aspects. The rejection of the is becomes an equivalent to the stressing of the stratification in the structure of human knowledge. To facilitate training, we should stress both aspects by all available means and should involve as many nerve centers as we can. Thus, through the ear, we stress verbally the formula of the rejection of the is of identity by indicating with our finger the different orders of abstractions, in the meantime affecting the eye while we repeat this is not this. We utilize the kinesthetic centers not only by pointing the finger to different levels, but also by making broad motions with our hands indicating the stratifications. We should train in both horizontal and vertical stratifications, always using the hands. The horizontal stratification indicates the difference or ordering of different order abstractions. The vertical stratification indicates the difference between man and animal and the differences between the different absolute individuals. In both cases, the semantic effect of the is of identity is counteracted. The above procedure in training has an important neurological foundation. Besides what has been explained already, we find that a word has 4 principal characteristics with corresponding cortical representations. A word can be heard, seen, spoken, and written. Language thus involves many nervous functions, e.g., auditory, visual, and diversified motor nerve centers interconnected in the most complex network of horizontal and vertical fibers. The Use of the differential involves all available nervous channels. We see, we hear, we speak, we move our hands, indicating stratification, non-allness, engaging large cortical areas, and so have the maximum probability of affecting, through non-elementalistic methods, the organism as a whole. The differential gives us a special, simplified, yet advanced interracial structural symbolism, 1933, which affects wide nervous areas of the illiterate or nearly illiterate person or of the infant, which otherwise could not be affected. It is known that extensive reading and writing, as well as speaking a number of languages, has a very marked cultural effect and helps visualization and consciousness of abstracting. The reason can be found, perhaps, in the fact that a learned polyglot or a scholar utilizes many nerve centers in the coordination. In the older days, unless one became a scholar of some sort, it was extremely difficult to train these nerve centers in coordination. With the differential, we can train simply and comparatively quickly all necessary nerve centers, and so impart to children and to practically illiterate persons the cultural results of prolonged and difficult university training without any complicated technique. This last should always be regarded as a means and not as an end. In my experience with children, and with men from the lowest mentality to the highest, the non-identity of different orders of abstractions is usually taken lightly. It all seems so simple and self-evident that no one assumes that there could be serious unconscious structural, semantic, linguistic, and neurological delusional mechanisms involved which cannot be reached without specially devised non-identity training. The delusional feelings of allness and identity are peculiar in that, like other pathological states, they tend to appear as all-pervading. It is the most difficult in daily, as well as in medical, experience to make a breach in this all-pervading tendency, but once this delusional state is even partially replaced by glimpses of multi-ordinal reality, the further elaboration and training and adjustment to reality becomes comparatively simple. Thus, in practice, if we start with ordinary objects, feelings, and words, and train in the non-allness and non-identity, any child or any grown-up, even an imbecile, can follow this easily. Once this feeling has been acquired, and in most cases it is only a matter of method and persistence to acquire it, the main semantic blockage has been eliminated, and the rest is comparatively easy. I have had no opportunity yet to verify it, but I am convinced that even a superior imbecile could be trained to differentiate between descriptions and inferences after he has learned to differentiate between the objective levels and words. In such a training with imbeciles, we can go in simplicity as far as desired. Thus, if the given individual is hungry and says he wants bread, we hand him a label which is attached to the objective bread, and he would be quickly made to realize that the symbol is not the thing symbolized. It should be realized that in the training, we should impart the obvious fact that words or labels represent conveniences and are not the objects or feelings themselves. We should carry the labels in our pockets, so to say, as we carry our money, or checks for hats or trunks, and not identify them emotionally with what they eventually stand for, because monetary standards change and hats and trunks get exchanged, lost, or burnt. To accomplish this, we must have objective labels which we may handle and carry in our pockets, and also an objective something to which we can attach the labels. In the present non-Aristotelian system, the rejection of the is of identity is complete and applies to all levels. Thus, the event is not the object is not the label, description is not inference, a proper name is not a class name, and on. The characteristics ascribed to events, objects, or labels are not identical. An object, a situation, or a feeling is not identical with another object, situation, or feeling, and on, all of which establishes a structure of horizontal and vertical stratification. At an early age of the training, we must begin with what appears the simplest and most obvious to the child, namely, the absence of identity between the word and the object, or that the word is not the object. We accomplish this by stressing that one cannot sit on the word chair, that one cannot write with the word pencil, or drink with the word milk. These simple facts should always be translated into the generalized form, indicating with the hand the two levels on the differential, conjointly with the fundamental formula, this is not this. We should always tell the child that the formula is entirely general, but for the present, we should not go into any further details. At this stage, we can advance one step further, still using only ordinary objects as examples, and explain the unspeakable character of the object, namely, that whatever we can see, taste, smell, handle, etc., is an absolute individual, demonstrated empirically, and unspeakable. We then take the apple, bite it, actually performing, and explain that although the object is not words, yet we are very much interested, and traditionally so, in this unspeakable level. Then we explain repeatedly and at length, emphasizing the important principle of evaluation, that to live we must deal with the objective level, yet this level cannot be reached by words alone. As a rule, it takes a few weeks or even months before this simple semantic reaction is established. The old identification of being psychologically very much ingrained. Once this is established, we stress the fact that we must handle, look, and listen, never speak, but remain silent outwardly as well as inwardly in order to find ourselves on the objective level. Here we come to one of the most difficult steps in the whole training. This silence on the objective level involves checking upon neutral grounds of a great many emotions, preconceived ideas, etc. This step, in the meantime, appears as the first and simplest, most obvious and most effective psychophysiological reality factor in eliminating the delusional identifications. Once the child is thoroughly aware of the absence of identity between words and objects, we may attempt the expanding of the notion object to the objective levels. Such training requires persistence, even though it seems fundamentally simple. We demonstrate and explain that action, actual bodily performance, and all objective happenings are not words. At a later stage, we explain that a toothache, or demonstrate that the actual pain of a prick, are not words, and belong to the objective, unspeakable levels. Still later, we enlarge this notion to cover all ordinary objects, all actions, functions, performances, processes going on outside our skin, and also all immediate feelings, emotions, moods, etc., going on inside our skins, which are not words. We enlarge the silence to all happenings on the objective levels, and the animalistic human nature begins to be changed into quite a different human nature. When this is accomplished, the rest is much simplified, although much more subtle. We explain as simply as we can the problems of evaluation and semantic reactions, stressing and making obvious the fact that our actual lives are lived entirely on objective, unspeakable levels. We illustrate this all the time by simple examples such as our sleeping or eating, any activities or pain, pleasure, immediate feelings, emotions, which are not words. If words are not translated into the first order unspeakable effects, with the result that we do not do something, or do not feel something, or do not learn or remember something, etc., such words take no effect and become useless noises. One fact should be stressed, namely that the problem is not one of inadequacy of words. We can always invent adequate words, but even the most ideal and structurally adequate language will not be the things or feelings themselves. On this point, there is no possible compromise. Many people still utter quite happily pessimistic expressions about the present language based on silent assumptions connected with the unconscious delusional identification, and believe that in an adequate language the word, by some good primitive magic, would be identical with the thing. The more the denial of the is of identity is driven home, and the sooner it becomes a part of one's semantic reaction, the sooner the consciousness of the abstracting is acquired. We are now ready to go further into the theory of natural evaluation based on natural order. As a preliminary step, we must show repeatedly the difference between descriptions and inferences using simple examples. We must stress the fact that words, as such, must be divided into two categories. A first of descriptive in the main, functional words, and a second of inferential words, which involve assumptions or inferences. Thus, A does not get up in the morning may be considered as descriptive. If A explicitly refuses to get up, the statement A refuses to get up in the morning may also be considered as descriptive. If A did not explicitly refuse, this statement becomes inferential because A may be dead or paralyzed. If we would say simply A is lazy, such as statement represents an illegitimate inference of high orders based on ignorance, because in 1933 it is known that laziness represents a symptom of physico-chemical colloidal or semantic disturbances. It should be stressed that this discrimination between descriptive and inferential words, although extremely important, is not based on any absolute differences, but to a large extent depends on the context. I shall not analyze this problem further because any parent or teacher who has acquired the consciousness of abstracting himself will find more examples at hand than are needed. We should notice here a very vital yet generally disregarded structural fact, that human life is lived under conditions which establish a natural order of importance between different orders of abstractions. This natural order should be made the basis of natural adaptive evaluation and so survival semantic reactions. As our lives are lived entirely on the unspeakable level, which includes not only scientific objects and ordinary objects, but also actions, functions, processes, performances, feelings, emotions, and on. This level is obviously first in importance, and the verbal level, which is only auxiliary, comes next in importance. The analysis of the relative evaluation between description and inferences appears extremely complex and would require a separate volume beyond the scope of the present work. Here we may assume the generally accepted opinion that the reliability of inferences depends on the reliability of the descriptive premises, and that description is more reliable than inference. In importance and in temporal and neurological natural order, description comes first, inferences next. If we consider different orders of inferences or inferential words, inferences or inferential words of lower order are more reliable and so more important than inferences of higher orders, inferences from inferences of lower orders. As science is a racial product and so represents structural descriptions and inferences of an enormous amount of constantly revised observations and formulations of past generations, this racial product, science, is more reliable and important in principle, particularly in its negative results, than the individual abstractions of individuals. If some individuals happen to be geniuses who upset racial scientific abstractions, they are under the scrutiny of other scientists who, no matter how biased or slow, remain judges of their products. In 1933, the opinion of scientists is the most dependable opinion we have. We must accept, at a given date, the racial, particularly negative abstractions as more reliable, establishing in evaluation the event, scientific object, first, and the ordinary object next. It should be stressed that the object of daily experience in human life is by far not so reliable as that in the life of animals entirely, without human interference. Thus, a high-tension wire or a third rail or high explosives are not found in unaided nature and do not forewarn us as ordinary objects do. These objects possess characteristics concealed or not obvious on the objective level of our ordinary inspection of, let us say, sight, hearing, or smell. Yet these characteristics appear just as real and dangerous as ever. It appears, then, that the scientific object or the event in contradistinction to the ordinary object is more important than the daily object, no matter how important the latter might be. In fact, the only macroscopic importance of objects outside of aesthetic and symbolic values may be found in those not obvious physical, chemical, microscopic, and submicroscopic characteristics. Thus, the importance of food or air or a chair is found precisely in these physico-chemical effects which result from eating, from breathing, and from resting on a chair. And so again, these hidden characteristics, revealed only by science, appear much more important than the gross characteristics manufactured by our nervous systems, which we recognize as an object. We come thus to a natural scale of a definite natural order, which also establishes the natural order of genetic importance and represents the natural base for survival, semantic evaluation. For our purpose, the relative order may be represented as the scientific object or the event first, ordinary object next, the ordinary object first, the label next, description first, inferences next, extended to descriptive and inferential words. If we use the is of identity and identify in value or importance the different, ultimately non-identical levels, we nullify in principle the natural order of evaluation, which by psychophysiological necessity appears as a reversal of natural order in various degrees. We find many reasons for this curious fact, but for our purpose, it will be enough to suggest that 1. Words are simpler and take less effort to handle than objects. 2. Inferences, being higher order abstractions than descriptions, are psychologically closer to our feelings and easier for any individual to manage than impersonal descriptions, which require developed linguistic training, power of observation, self-mastery, etc., and in general consciousness of abstracting. The reversal of the natural order must lead to non-adjustment and results in pathological symptoms in different degrees. The natural order consists of asymmetrical relations expressed by an ordered series, not only as to space-time, but as to values. All our experiences and all we know indicate definitely that ordinary materials, objects, are extremely rare and very complex special cases of the Becknottedness of the plenum, that the organic world and life represent extremely rare and still more complex special cases of the material world, and finally, so-called intelligent life represents increasingly complex and still rarer special cases of life. When we identify the members of these series, we disregard the asymmetrical character of this series and transform it into fictitious or delusional or false to fact symmetrical relation of identity. it becomes also obvious why in the Aristotelian system, which did not allow asymmetrical relations, proper evaluation, adjustment, and sanity in general were in principle impossible. Although the language used in this connection is not familiar, it is not entirely arbitrary. It appears experimentally that four-dimensional order has physiological importance on the one hand, and on the other, that on the psychological levels it involves the semantic factors of evaluation. In training in the physiological natural order, we train the evaluation or appropriate human and adult semantic reaction on the psychological levels. In the difference between the unspeakable scientific object and the ordinary object, the objective level and the verbal level, we find the precise spot at which we differ most radically from the animals. If we disregard these differences and retain the is of identity, we must somehow copy animals in our nervous processes. Through wrong evaluation, we are using the lower centers too much and cannot think properly. We are over-emotional, we get easily confused, worried, terrorized, or discouraged, or else we become absolutists, dogmatists, etc. The result of such copying of animals are usually tragic, as might be expected. Owing to wrong evaluation, we add self-made semantic difficulties to the difficulties which we actually find in nature. When we live in a delusional world, we multiply our worries, fears, and discouragements, and our higher nerve centers, instead of protecting us from overstimulation, actually multiplying the semantic harmful stimuli indefinitely. Under such circumstances, sanity is impossible. It seems that here in the elimination of the is of identity, we have put our hands on an extremely powerful reflex mechanism for the education or re-education of our emotional life. As has already been said, suppressing or repressing our feelings is dangerous and should be avoided. The old animalistic educational systems were built on repression and suppression with sad results. But since we had no other means of education, we had to use the older means or else abandon this special education altogether. Not so in the new non-Aristotelian way with the structural differential. We do not repress or suppress. We teach silence on the objective level in general, which is the most impressive emotional education on perfectly neutral grounds. One of the consequences of the elimination of the is of identity. Any bursting into speech is not repressed. A gesture of the hand to the labels reminds us that words are not objects, or actions, or happenings, or feelings. Such procedure has a most potent semantic effect. It gives a semantic jar, yet this jar is not repression, but the realization of a most fundamental, natural, structural fact of evaluation, in which we should all be well trained. Disturbing semantic reactions subside, and no one is hurt. It takes long and persistent training, but the results are most beneficial. We must know an important difference between a statement involving the is of identity that we are animals, which has nothing to do with the actual facts. All of us, the animals too, are not words, but represent absolute individuals and all different, and the statement that we copy animals and our nervous reactions. In the first case, nothing can be done. In the second case, although the results are equally sad, we can stop copying animals the moment the mechanism is discovered and we begin to realize that we are doing so. Thus, the old hopeless becomes hopeful. I have already mentioned that some educators may assume the eventual harmfulness of training in the consciousness of abstracting on the ground that children should be kept close to reality. The answer to such an argument can be found in the recognition that what in the ordered days what in the older days seemed reality must now, in the light of new knowledge, be considered delusions, and the older training as preparatory for acquired insanity. The modern conditions of human life appear much more complex than those of animal life or of the primitive man. Every year, perhaps even every month, new human realities make their appearance, complexities arise, and our educational systems do not equip the children semantically to meet these new conditions. After investigations, one may find by himself that the older allness and identifications represent delusional factors found nowhere in the empirical world, and thus have to conclude that if we train children in such delusions, adjustment to the actual world is made extremely difficult, if not impossible. It is true that some beneficial results do not appear at once, but only after the full consciousness of abstracting is acquired. Thus, at an early stage of the training, when the student begins to realize the delusional character introduced by the is of identity, the general and well-known tendency may struggle hard to retain the delusions. His first reaction may be that of disappointment with its many concomitants, depending on his temperament, metaphysics, and on. But when he acquires the freedom of the full consciousness of abstracting, all levels will be evaluated properly, and he will be able to adjust himself to conditions of multi-ordinal reality described in the present work, which cannot be avoided by anyone. Knowledge or intelligence is only possible with abstracting, and therefore it fundamentally involves non-allness. Omniscience would involve a knowledge of every point even. These are fundamentally different, and such a world would be one of chaos, where knowledge would be impossible. Life, multi-ordinal abstracting, and multi-ordinal intelligence start together and are conditioned by the multi-ordinal process of abstracting. Among the many semantically beneficial results of such training, besides the training in sanity and therefore in adjustment, a few other benefits should be mentioned. Our life, our multi-ordinal mentation, the structure of our language with its syllogisms, fallacies, and on consists for the most part of the constant utilization of the different levels of abstractions. This appears as an inherent characteristic of human knowledge, and therefore we cannot abolish it without abolishing multi-ordinal intelligence altogether. Intelligence requires the passing from level to level in both directions. All the benefits we possess follow from this, but also many semantic dangers are hidden in it. Similar remarks could be made about an automobile. A great many beneficial results follow from the use of automobiles, but there are also great dangers involved. For instance, at present we have regulations for the driving of an automobile. A driver has to pass his examination, demonstrate his practical reflex ability in driving before he is allowed to drive in public. Similarly, with our language, we find the greatest benefits in it, and we should utilize them. Proper training in the use of language should teach us how to avoid dangers. Obviously, consciousness of abstracting teaches us how to avoid these dangers. Likewise, once we become trained in the passing to higher and higher order of abstractions, we become capable of the performance of what we call high intelligence. The difference between high intelligence and low intelligence consists in the fact that a high intelligence has a larger outlook backwards as well as forward. A low intelligence, as suggested in Figure 2, sees only a little backwards, ignorance, and foresees only a little. A high intelligence has a larger span or field. It knows more about the past and looks further into the future. It is no mystery that when we want to look further into the past, and the future, we need higher and higher order abstractions. By training in this passing to higher and higher abstractions, we train the mind to be more efficient. This mental expanding should be the structural and semantic aim of every education. Once we eliminate identification, we must accept structure as the only possible content of knowledge, and also realize that no knowledge is ever free from some structural assumptions. Sometimes it is pathetic to watch the metaphysical performance of some otherwise very eminent scientists who seem entirely innocent of these facts. They often attempt to divorce their metaphysics from science and miss the point that primitive metaphysics represents science, or the structural assumptions of that period, whereas modern science represents structural assumptions or metaphysics of modern times, which cannot be reconciled with the older science. The difference appears in dates, not in kind. The real problem before mankind presents itself in the selection of the structural metaphysics. If we select the primitive structural assumptions and have to live under present conditions, we must become a split personality which cannot adjust itself. If we accept modern structural assumptions called science, we may adjust ourselves. In no case can we free ourselves entirely from some structural assumptions. The problem becomes one of dates and of unsanity versus sanity. These problems appear of unusual importance because the difficult scientific technique does not enter into this field at all, and the few structural data, 1933, can be given in the simplest form to children and even to the feeble-minded. In the older days, this problem was entirely misunderstood. We tried to popularize science in the sense that we translated structurally correct language into the daily language of primitive structure. This resulted only in the bewilderment. We did not analyze the structure of language and its role in our lives and begin with a structural linguistic revision. Once this revision is accomplished and we build a non-Aristotelian language, the semantic background is prepared for a natural acceptance of modern structural metaphysics, science, of each date, and the older popularization becomes unnecessary. Such procedure would help to integrate the individual, while the older methods only help to split him. Let us recall that the animal stops somewhere in his abstracting. When we come to a stop and consider it final, or that we know all about it, we copy animals in our nervous reactions. Training in passing from order to order of abstractions, as such, trains the particularly human fluid non-blocked semantic reactions, counteracts, and ultimately abolishes the animalistic blockage. In the language of a given structure, we can express ourselves in a definite way, and if that way is incomplete, we must leave the field open, for in a structurally different language, the issues may look entirely different. It is fundamental to stress that the old unknowable becomes entirely abolished. This unknowable originated in the primitive identification and elementalism. Our ancestors could not miss indefinitely that identification was false to facts, yet somehow the emphasis which the ecclesiastical authorities, for their purpose, laid on the importance of the Aristotelian system prevented them from completely rejecting the is of identity. The unspeakable was called the unknowable, a very gloomy term indeed. The use of this term prevented them from discovering long ago that the only content of knowledge appears as a structural with all the following non-elementalistic consequences. Knowledge was expected to represent somehow more than knowledge, a silent self-contradiction on this foundation. On this foundation, whole systems of delusions were built. With the newer realizations, we understood that the only possible content of knowledge appears as structural, so that we can know all which belongs to the structural legitimate field of knowledge. What does not belong to the field of knowledge must be considered meaningless, and making noises about it one way or another will not help us at all. Quite the contrary, it involves us in delusional states. Students of the history of philosophy may realize in this case particularly the drama and the dangers which the playing on such multi-ordinal terms as knowledge may needlessly produce. Through the semantic mechanism which it involves, consciousness of abstracting abolishes many fears, despairs, and other disturbances which follow from the confusion of orders of abstractions. We become introverted extroverts. In other words, we become effectively well balanced and ready to deal with empirical first order effects on their levels, and with verbal problems on their different levels. We learn also to observe as soon as we have learned silence on the objective levels, realizing that we are abstract in different orders. We slowly acquire the most creative structural feeling that human knowledge is inexhaustible. We become more and more interested in knowledge. Our curiosity becomes aroused, our sporting spirit stimulated, and our level of multi-ordinal intelligence raised. It is well known that the higher intelligence is characterized by a critical attitude, by training with the structural differential until the memory of the characteristics left out and the non-identity become a permanent semantic acquisition with us. This critical attitude is also developed. No one who feels habitually these characteristics left out, this is not this, will ever take a word or a statement for granted. He will inquire, investigate, will always ask, "What do you mean?" a question which automatically leads to further investigation and finally strikes the bottom of the undefined terms which divulge our silent structural creeds and metaphysics. We should avoid the mistake of assuming that the average man or a moron does not think. His nervous system works continually, as does that of a genius. The difference consists in that its working is not productive or efficient. Proper training and understanding of the semantic mechanism must add to efficiency and productiveness. By the elimination of semantic blockings, as in identification, we release the creative capacity of any individual. We release him from the primitive semantic bondage in the daily and constant use of a powerful instrument called language, full of benefits but also full of dangers, the structure of which he totally misunderstands. Such misunderstanding must lead to inefficiency in the use and so to the abuse of this function. Instead of being a semantic slave of the structure of language, he becomes its master. When we become more civilized and enlightened, no public speaker or writer will be allowed to operate publicly without demonstrating first that he knows the structure and semantic functioning of the linguistic capacities. Even at present, no professor, teacher, lawyer, physician, or chemist, and on, is allowed to operate publicly without passing examination to show that he knows his subject. The above statement does not mean control or censorship. Far from it. Our language involves a much more intricate, beneficial, or dangerous semantic mechanism than any automobile ever had or will have. We do not control the drivers in their destinations. They come and go as they please, but for public safety, we demand that they should have acquired the necessary reflex skill for driving, and so we eliminate unnecessary tragedies. Similarly with language, of which the ignorant or pathological use becomes a public danger of a very serious semantic character. At present, public writers or speakers can hide behind ignorance. 1933, of the verbal, semantic, and neurological mechanism. They may mean well, yet by playing upon the pathological reactions of their own and those of the mob, They may put over some very vicious propaganda and bring about very serious sufferings to all concerned. But once they would have to pass an examination to get their license as public speakers or writers, they could not hide any longer behind ignorance. If found to have misused the linguistic mechanism, such an abuser on their part would be clearly a willful act, and well-meaning would cease to be an alibi. We must accept the obvious facts which make the older theoretical democracy or the older theoretical socialism a scientific impossibility. If in 1933 99% of the population of the globe appear as infantile or mentally deficient, how can anyone expect that the majority or the mass could ever have proper evaluation or non-pathological semantic reactions? All history shows at present, and this evidence should not be taken lightly by scientifically enlightened society, that the majority appears always wrong, and that all that we call progress, civilization, science, and on, has been achieved by a very small minority. Such an understanding should guide our future conduct if we desire better results than we have at present. Under non-Aristotelian conditions, not the state nor different private societies, but professional scientific bodies would have to set the standards and perfect the technique of the linguistic structural examinations. They would also select members who would serve on the examination boards. It might seem that such a non-Aristotelian innovation would not be important or far-reaching. This would be a mistake. It seems that most of those public writers and speakers may be considered privately as honest men, who do not realize that under Aristotelian conditions they often impose on defenseless masses delusional states which too often become of a pronounced morbid character. Once such an examination would force them to look into structural, semantic, and linguistic problems, we may take for granted that a great many of them would become able to evaluate properly their own activities and comprehend the harm they do. As a result, quite probably a great amount of useless befogging issues, delusional writings, and speeches would not be produced, with great benefit to all concerned. No one would censor them. Consciousness of abstracting would accomplish that. They would become their own censors, aided also by the newly developed consciousness of abstracting on the part of some members of the audiences or readers. It would be desirable to experiment and introduce parallel classes in schools for a while, one group continuing in the old Aristotelian system, the other being trained in the non-Aristotelian system. We may expect that at the end of a year the results would be fairly tangible. The ones which acquire the consciousness of abstracting should show a marked improvement in character, should behave better, and should also show better results in scholarship, not to mention, in addition, the preventative semantic benefits in their future life and adjustment. Experimenting under various conditions is very desirable as we deal with such a tremendously broad and fundamental structural problem that it is impossible at present to foresee more than the main results and bearings. In a school, one three-dimensional differential should be enough, but in each classroom, a large printed diagram, which is published also, should be permanently exhibited on the walls and applied in all studies. This is necessary, not only because such a reminder makes the children thoroughly familiar with the characteristics left out, natural order, and on, but also because the children will discuss it and settle their educational and personal difficulties by its aid, and so train themselves in non-Aristotelian reactions. In my practice, I have found that one of the main difficulties of the learner or in thinking in general consists in the fact that in any verbal discussion, we must utilize different orders of abstractions and multi-ordinal terms. If we do not realize this, the problem often seems very involved. Once we are conscious of it, however, the problem becomes simple. In fact, it may be said that this special flexibility, which is entirely absent in animals and little developed in the primitive man, represents the working mechanism of high intelligence, and that this special flexibility can be acquired through proper non-Aristotelian training. The dealing with reflex reactions and with experimental theories in general has one very encouraging characteristic, namely that no matter how difficult the theoretical side may be, the practical is invariably extremely simple. Thus, a theoretical treatise on the Einstein theory or the new quantum mechanics, or on an automobile, radio, or piano, or on music, or the conditional reflexes of Pavlov, and on may present, and in fact generally does present difficulties because it is formulated on the purely verbal and analytical level. But these levels are most important, for we find that on these levels the full evaluation and so the full realization of existing or possible relations and meanings is accomplished. In these verbal levels, we find also economical and effective means to analyze further developments on which the possible range of applications ultimately depends. Such a treatise can be produced by a single man and thereby becomes available for the rest of us. A description of the application is, however, very simple. We label the related parts of some structure, describe mostly in terms of order their interrelations, and then give instructions how to act, push, pull, or turn a given part to get such and such results. These descriptions, although verbal, refer exclusively to some physical structure, so that men of very low mentality can soon become acquainted with the practical problems concerned. When the reflex handling of the physical structure is acquired, the experimental and behavioristic aspects become childishly simple. A child can see the experimental results of any theory, or notice the ease and simplicity of the reflex adjustments a good driver can make. But with an infant or a savage or an ignorant man, cannot do is appreciate the meanings of given occurrences and evaluate them. In other words, they cannot relate the given occurrences to other occurrences, which alone give the significance of the happenings. Thus, not only physicists, but even the average man, knew of the equality of gravitational and inertial mass. It took the genius of an Einstein, however, to evaluate properly, to have the proper semantic reaction towards this commonplace fact. The present work shows clearly that all semantic disturbances exhibit a lack of proper evaluation or in getting hold of the meanings or relations or order of different order abstractions. Only a full theoretical understanding can supply us with those meanings and produce in us the proper semantic reactions of evaluation, a necessary psychophysiological step for the further advance and for full application of the conquests already made. As the present work is experimental throughout the deals with verifiable subjects, such as the structure of languages on record, the natural order of development, and pathological reversal of order, which, if again reversed, restores the natural order, and when applied brings about most beneficial experimental results. All that has been said about experimental theories applies fully in our case. Just as in other disciplines, the instructions are simple. Push these, pull this, or turn that. So in our case, this simple descriptive rule, which refers to the objective differential, is given as this is not this. Once the reflex activities have been acquired, we can, for instance, enjoy the pleasure of an automobile trip, the music of a radio, or a semantic trip toward sanity in harmony with ourselves and others, very simply in spite of the underlying theoretical complexities, which are always means and not ends in themselves. But here we must face an important difference. It is easy to demonstrate empirically to the majority of us the usefulness or pleasurableness of automobiles and radios, but it is very difficult to demonstrate the benefits of consciousness, of abstracting, to those who have not acquired it. Before the experimental data begin to accumulate and become common knowledge, the main evaluation will have to be made on theoretical grounds. Besides, before children can be trained by the simple and easy methods outlined above, adults must first retrain and reshape their own semantic reactions, which retraining and reshaping are not easy and require their own semantic reactions, and require even more difficult theoretical considerations. Because of this, the present work had to be written in the form of a textbook for parents, teachers, physicians, and workers in mental hygiene, and for future students and research workers in psychophysiology and semantic hygiene. At the beginning, in the application of the method, a number of difficulties will be discovered, which will have to be overcome. As a rule, the training in non-pathological semantic reactions proves to be easiest and simplest with the very young children. Most of it, or at least the laying down of the semantic foundations for such reactions, should be accomplished at home by specially trained teachers, if the parents are unable to do that themselves. In countries or communities where the national or local government shows an interest in the health of the population by providing, for instance, specialists in preventive vaccination, specialists to training in preventive measures against semantic disturbances will probably also be provided. In elementary schools, the teachers at first will have to train themselves as best they can with the help of specialists. But in high schools, colleges, and universities, special instructors will have to be employed. The first concern, then, is to start the education and training of teachers. With this end in view, the present work has been written so as to form a fairly complete outline of the whole problem. Reference literature has been indicated so that anyone who wants to specialize in the subject can find some suitable textbooks as a primer. As to qualifications for the professional non-Aristotelian instructors, it is at present very difficult to foresee details, but as the full consciousness of abstracting leads to semantic reactions, which also follow unconsciously, or which should so follow from the study and acquiring the feel of the calculus, students of mathematics would perhaps be the most desirable. Any specialist in a new line of work has to learn a great deal, and this cannot be avoided, but it makes a difference what kind of training one has had as a young person. Thus, it is simpler for a student of mathematics to learn about psychiatry or psychologics than for a psychiatrist or a psychologician to learn mathematics. However, for a person with university training, this is less important than a genuine willingness to master the subject. Once the consciousness of abstracting has been acquired by such a student, his semantic blockages will be eliminated. He will then have no difficulties whatsoever with details, or even in doing creative work along this line. With very young children in the beginning, an hour a day for several months should be devoted to this subject. When they have acquired the consciousness of abstracting, the results should not be entirely trusted as to permanence, but at least once a week the problems should be recalled to them. How many hours a week should be devoted to it in high schools, colleges, and universities I shall not venture to suggest, because this working hours in these institutions are already very crowded. The training in consciousness of abstracting automatically eliminates an enormous amount of semantic blockages and would facilitate the acquisition of learning in all branches of knowledge, and so save time and effort, the more so if the respective teachers themselves were to become conscious of abstracting. The beneficial results which are to be expected may be found in better scholarship, more interest in studies, improved character, higher multi-ordinal intelligence, and a better general adjustment. All of this seems quite apart from the preventive character of the training as a protection against many semantic disturbances in the future. But when teachers of all subjects acquire consciousness of abstracting themselves, they will probably discover new means and methods of conveying more simply and more effectively what they wish to convey to their pupils. I am convinced that the hours spent on semantic training would actually turn out to be an important economy of efforts. Moreover, it would effectively give the child and students the highest grade of cultural training, which at present we acquire only occasionally and with difficulty without the conscious cooperation of our teachers.